Is Antaeus Wards OP? It's kind of hard to defend these, right? Like when you see shenanigans like those, what do you say to that? Today, fellas, I actually want to go over the history of Antaeus Wards, where it was, the previous buffs that it had received, why it was never top tier before, and how the perfect storm occurred in Season of the Worthy. So first up, Antaeus actually launched in Forsaken. I was a big fan of it. We even made an entire video on everything that it could reflect. I had a very fun time with these exotics. The downside to them, though, was they weren't that consistent, which actually led to a buff in Sandbox 2.2.0, which was actually last year of 2019 in March, where Antaeus Wards got a consistency buff, essentially fixing an issue where improved slide was not consistently applying with Antaeus Wards. Now that helped it a little bit. We had a few videos showing it off. Antaeus seemed to be a little more consistent, but there was still a lot of times that even in your slide, you would die. Until, of course, Sandbox 2.8.0, essentially stating that Antaeus Wards and the shield created by it no longer allows chip damage through. This was a major change. First up, let's just kind of go over what chip damage actually is. Essentially, when you go to slide with Antaeus Wards, the exotic perk Reflective Vents activates. Gives you that improved slide. Sliding reflects incoming projectiles. Also, reflecting projectiles grant super energy. Nothing has really changed here in that exotic perk trait outside of what Bungie has done behind the scenes. You see, chip damage originally allowed damage to bypass the shield depending on when and where you slide. So starting at the front of the slide, it would only reflect a portion of the damage that you receive, but toward the end of the slide, it would reflect the most, which is why timing was so key. Unfortunately though, that timing was a little more difficult to really hone in on, which is why most people just didn't even use it. A lot of people, including myself, just thought the exotic was bugged, but that chip damage being allowed through was actually by design. But in Season of the Worthy, getting rid of that chip damage just turned this exotic into S tier, essentially giving you immunity, full 100% block damage from the beginning of your slide to the end, basically making you immune to everything. Needless to say, Antaeus Wards has risen in the ranks. It's probably become the most used exotic on the Titan class, even surpassing that of Dune Marchers. And considering that One-Eye Mask got a nerf in this season, I think every Titan was actually clamoring to find the next best thing. Now, like One-Eye Mask, Antaeus is in a similar situation. And that situation is that if I play a game and I'm playing as a Titan, I feel like I'm automatically nerfing myself by not using this exotic. Fallout put it greatly yesterday when we brought up Bastion and it possibly being overpowered. The conclusion, I can use other things other than Bastion and not feel like I'm at a disadvantage. I know there's a lot of people that have opinions about Bastion. Some think it's overpowered, others think it's in the right spot. As I stated in yesterday's video, I think it adds an extra bit of flavor to the current meta, considering that all special weapons are being dominated by snipers and shotguns. Having a Bastion in the mix, on top of it being an exotic, is all right with me. Antaeus, on the other hand, that's a different story. It is an exotic that I feel like, especially in something like Trials, that if I'm not using it, I am putting myself at a disadvantage. This actually arose pretty early on in Trials for myself. It was Rusted Lands. I was trying to use other exotics at the beginning of the weekend. We were trying to give everything a fair shake. By about halfway through the stream though, when I realized that we had to get these carries done, and me being hard-headed about what exotics I should be using, I decided, hey, what the hell, let's just throw in Antaeus. And immediately, this upped my game. It upped my survivability. For the times that it actually does reflect damage back, it made for easy cleanups. And probably the biggest selling point outside of immunity is the fact that reflecting projectiles grants super energy. Now, reflecting projectiles is not reflecting projectiles into your enemies. It's not like doing damage with those reflections generates super energy. No, that's just basic reflection. I will actually intentionally slide behind corners, back and forth in sniper lanes just to tank a sniper shot, especially against something like Revoker. Number one, that Revoker loses a bullet. Number two, I get super energy. It's a win-win, man. And as a Titan, Antaeus Wards is the best exotic to use in the current sandbox, which is kind of funny because originally everybody was complaining about Dune Marchers, which Dune Marchers all on their own are very potent. But notice that everything has kind of died down about Dunes. Not many people are talking about Dune Marchers that much, which just reflects how good Antaeus Wards actually is. It has completely taken over the conversation for good reason. Now, Antaeus Wards Should it be nerfed, and how should it be nerfed? This is what Bungie's probably already analyzing now. And believe me, guys, a nerf is probably on the way. It's just how Bungie's doing. And considering that Trials of Osiris is out, be prepared for Sandbox changes to roll out very, very quickly. We already saw Hardlight this past week already be dealt with by itself, individually. There was no big batch of Sandbox updates that included Hardlight. Instead, Bungie went ahead and took the initiative and dealt with Hardlight individually before the season was even over. So I think weapons that are a little overpowered, that are a little much, and exotic armors will be individually tweaked throughout a season. But in Bungie fashion, most things that do receive a nerf receives it pretty severely. Antaeus could be completely dismantled, and I know a lot of people want that. A lot of people want to just jump up and completely destroy these exotics. Some have even asked for it to be locked out of Trials completely. I think Antaeus Wards, if it was to be nerfed, should receive a nerf in its duration in which you can proc reflective vents. OSK and I actually talked about it. Currently right now, what is it? Every other slide, if I was to continually slide, which is what, maybe 2 seconds, 2.5, reflective vents will proc for you. Meaning if I wanted to push into a group of enemies and I start sliding from the beginning toward the end, every other slide will proc reflective vents, giving me super energy if you happen to be trying to melt me with a primary. And on top of that, it makes for mindless aping on my end. You know, Antaeus Wards previously, when it used to allow chip damage through, really put a lot on us to play tactically, to time our slots, to not overuse it. And considering that that chip damage could get through pretty much any weapon, even primaries that were consistently doing damage, some of it got through, which normally made for situations where I was trying to ape from one end of the map to the other. I would normally either die before I got to the target or be easy cleanup. I really don't want chip damage to come back though. There was a lot of people that never even used Antaeus Wards. I didn't even use Antaeus much, even though I love them. But the benefit that they offered didn't actually stack it higher than other exotics when it allowed chip damage to come through. Instead, if we were just to nerf the duration in which you can reproc reflective vents to say something like 9 seconds, which by the way is like the equivalent of a max mobility hunter, I think this is a much better route. Would you still be immune in that slide? Yes. Would you be able to sit there and slide over and over and over again? No. Me sitting around a corner sliding back and forth, taking sniper shots over and over again, feeding myself super, I won't be able to do that. Not nearly as effectively. On top of that, if there was actually a 9-second cooldown, this is going to make every Titan really back up here. Whoa, should I slide here or should I save my slide? Sound familiar? That's exactly how Antaeus was used in the previous Sandbox, but better. Because it gives you that immunity, because it makes you invulnerable during that slide, it still keeps its exotic nature. It still retains its identity. And reverting it back to what it was before, I think that's just going to completely destroy this exotic, which every single Titan after that is just going to run dunes. Now, the other things that people have offered, what if you could not actually do damage while sliding with Antaeus Wards and reflective vents active? Most notably here recently when we went over Bastion, that's kind of what allowed Bastion to really shine on this week's map. I can be going in, I can be getting the slide, I can be tanking damage while at the same time pre-charging my fusion rifle. It's nasty. Being a 7 to 80 charge time, this allows me to come out of my reflective vents, out of my immunity, to be blasting you in the face. If Bungie knows how to figure out something like that, I mean, I guess I would be okay with it. I don't know. I mean, a duration nerf on top of the inability to be offensive behind your shield while sliding, I would be okay with both of those things, actually. I mean, quite frankly, Antaeus probably shouldn't be used as offensively as it is, outside of the reflection damage that you get. If they can figure that out, I think that would actually be okay. But I think a duration nerf is the first step. You're going to see in actual group engagements where there's a single Titan in front of you, he won't be able to chain these immunity barriers from target to target with something like a 9-second cooldown. A 9-second cooldown will either push him to play more passively, or if he does play aggressively, he'll be easily gunned down. And there are ways to counter Antaeus Wards, working on timing, keeping distance. Surprisingly, this past weekend, even though I'm using Bastion with Antaeus Wards and it's very disgusting together as just a counter to Antaeus Wards, Bastion was actually doing really good. That 780 millisecond time there for the charge time with Bastion is just enough time for that Titan to come right out of that barrier, out of that immunity phase, to suddenly find themselves face to face with that fusion rifle, and 9 times out of 10 would result in in me winning the duel. So guys, that is my suggestion on Antaeus Wards. I don't want to see this exotic be reverted to what it was before. I would much rather keep its uniqueness. Instead, throw on that duration nerf. And if Bungie wants to include something to where you can't be as offensive while Reflective Vents is active, aka can't be charging a fusion rifle while mid-slide, if they can figure that out, I'm okay with entertaining that. On some level though, Antaeus does need to be retuned in some kind of way. I just hope it's not overboard. This is the first time Antaeus has ever been nasty. It had some funny features in the beginning when Forsaken launched, and even after the consistency buff in 2.2.0, very few people use these exotics. And Trials has a way of really making people zone in on one thing and they just want that one thing nerfed. The problem is that this affects the exotic in every other aspect of the game, which is no fun, which is why I don't necessarily like Trials being the one thing that decides what should be balanced and what shouldn't. And if we're not careful, fellas, we will end up in a very similar scenario to Year 3 of Destiny 1, where everything is nerfed. And I can promise you, you don't want that. Fellas and ladies, thank you all for coming and watching, and as always,
slap that like button like your mama told you right.